From 1935 to 1938, Cleveland, Ohio was gripped with terror due to a series of unsolved murders that even the most notorious detectives couldn't solve. Both men and women, mainly from the poorest areas, were turning up dead and decapitated with no evidence pointing to their murderer. Elliot Ness, the man who brought down Al Capone, headed the investigation in hopes of finding the culprit who would later become known as the Cleveland Torso Killer. Today's story is one of the great unsolved cases in modern criminal history, is graphic in nature, and viewer discretion is advised. This is Curious True Crime Tuesday. On September 23, 1935, two boys were tossing a softball near the south side of Kingsbury Run in Cleveland when the ball went tumbling down a hillside. One boy suggested a race to see who could get to the ball first. Once they reached the bottom of the hill, what they found was horrifying. The decapitated, emasculated body of Edward Andrassy lay crumpled in a bush with his head buried 20 feet from the body. When police arrived on scene, they discovered Edward completely naked except for a pair of black socks still left on his feet. Rope burns were found on each wrist, and the body was completely drained of blood. While searching the area, police found another body just 30 feet from Edward's. Victim 2 was older, shorter, and seemed to be in his late 40s. He'd been dead a few weeks before Edward. This victim had some sort of chemical on his body, causing it to be red and leather-like in texture. His body was missing his privates, as well as his head, and was drained of all blood. His head would be found 70 feet from the body. Nearby, the police found some clothing: a blue coat, white pants and shirt, and a light checkered hat. On some of the clothes that fit victim 2, blood was found, leaving police to believe he was later stripped and cleaned. Police found rope, a torch, and a water bucket containing engine oil laced with blood. Both men's privates were found together near one of the corpses. Sadly, victim 2 would never be identified. The coroner determined both victims' death to be decapitation. On January 26, 1936, Charles Page, a butcher located near Charity Hospital, was informed by a local resident that he may have been burglarized. The resident described 2 baskets full of meat just down the alley. When Charles went to investigate, he was horrified to find 2 baskets filled with the remains of a frozen human body. Inside the baskets was the lower half of a female torso, 2 thighs, and a right arm. The body would later be identified as Florence or Flo Polillo. Police arrived and immediately searched the area for the rest of the body parts, but it came up empty-handed. Within the next 10 days, most of her body parts would be found scattered around town. Flo was different from previous victims. Previously, the killer takes apart the body before rigor mortis sets in. Her cause of death was found to be decapitation. As hard as police tried, there were no clues or leads found. The horror would continue on June 5, 1936. 2 boys were playing hooky from school to go fishing near 55th Street Bridge. While looking for a good spot to cast, the boys discovered a pair of brown pants with something inside. Being curious, they decided to open them up. To their horror, they found a decapitated human head. Police headed to the scene in search of the head, but because the boys had fled, they didn't have an exact location. In the man's pants, the police found what we can assume were the rest of the man's clothing, as well as 20 feet away were a pair of shoes with the socks still inside. So police found his head, but where's the body? It wouldn't be until the next day that the police found the body lying outside the police station. The body was fully intact, unlike the other victims. However, like the others, his body was drained of all blood, and his cause of death was decapitation. Even with fingerprints, police were unable to identify this man. However, the man had 6 very distinct tattoos, so police took photographs and spread them around town to see if anyone could identify the man. However, this led nowhere. Nobody could identify him. To this day, he is forever known as the Tattooed Man. On July 22, 1936, a teen girl was taking advantage of the wonderful summer weather by taking a hike in the woods near her home. It's unclear whether she smelled or saw the body first, but she did find a decapitated male body in late decomposition laying on his chest. When police arrived 2 hours later, they found the head about 10 feet away from the body, next to the victim's bloody clothing. This victim was the only body found where they were murdered, and unfortunately, they would never be identified. On September 10, 1936, a man was sitting along a waterway in Kingsbury Run. He was waiting to catch a train when he saw two halves of a torso floating in the creek. Police were quick to arrive on scene and take the torso out of the creek and sent it straight to the morgue so no photos were taken. During the investigation, police found a pool that was being used as a sewer at the time. In that sewer, they found bits of human flesh. They determined from the flesh that the body had only been dead a few days prior. The fire department searched the pool and found both lower halves of each leg. This person's cause of death would also be determined as decapitation. Now with 6 victims, police believed whoever was doing this was very knowledgeable of the human anatomy and maybe either a doctor or a surgeon. While going through the autopsy, police found out that this victim had actually been alive while being dismembered. The autopsy was also able to tell us that whoever was doing this was doing it with incredible strength and without hesitation. Though police and the fire department searched, no other body parts were ever found, and unfortunately, this victim would also go unidentified. On February 23, 1937, a man went to Lake Erie to check on the sailboat he had stored through the winter. After this, he decided to look for driftwood along the beach, when he disturbingly discovered the torso of a woman washed up on shore. The coroner determined that this woman was different from previous victims. She had been dead when her head was decapitated, so her cause of death is completely unknown. 3 months later, the lower half of the victim would be found washed up on shore. Sadly, with so little pieces of this woman's body, this woman would go unidentified. On June 6, 1937, a boy was walking home after his trip to the movies. The boy walked past an abutment of a bridge, but stopped when he noticed something strange buried nearby. The boy gets closer and finds a human skull, so he runs home and calls the police. When police arrive, they dig up the head, as well as a burlap sack with pelvic remains inside. It was discovered that she had been dead for around a year at this point, and dental records showed that this would be 40-year-old Rose Wallace. After being examined, it would be determined that the cause of death was once again decapitation. On July 6, 1937, a local man walked onto the bridge in hopes of seeing a tugboat. To his horror, instead he found the lower half of a man's torso floating under the bridge. Police wouldn't be called for hours until the other half of the upper torso was found in a burlap sack. A week later, the right upper arm showed up, and then the left lower leg. With the autopsy report, police would realize that the killer was becoming more violent, and unfortunately, this man would never be identified. After this murder, things would go silent for almost a year. On April 8, 1938, a man was taking a stroll around the Cuyahoga River. 3 feet from the sewer outlet, he noticed a white object floating. Thinking it was a dead fish, he grabbed a stick and poked it. That's when he realized it was the lower half of a human leg amputated at the knee and ankle. About a month later, police dragged 2 burlap sacks out of the river that contained most of the legs and a torso. This time, the coroner would detect drugs in the victim's system and determine that it was a female. Unfortunately, she was never identified. On August 16, 1938, 3 men who sold scrap for a living were searching through a dump. One of the men was split off from the team to go to his truck. On his way there, he saw a blue blazer wrapped in a quilt. When he went to examine, he was overwhelmed by a putrid smell, so he called his 2 companions over to help him look. When they searched through it, they saw what they believed to be human remains. The men immediately called the police. When police arrived, they noticed immediately that it not only was wrapped in the blue coat, but it was also wrapped in brown butcher paper. Underneath the torso, they found 2 thighs held together by rubber bands, and 5 feet away, they found a severed head in a box. Strangely enough, the police found 2 arms and 2 legs in a box made of 2 separate boxes. One of the boxes was from a biscuit company in Cleveland, the other from a seafood company in Boston, Massachusetts. This was the first time a full body had been left behind since victim 5. The body was in such a state of decay that they were unsure whether the organs had been taken or just decomposed on their own. The coroner believed that some of the body parts had been frozen and mummified, and determined that the body was a female. Though dental records and thumbprints were taken, this woman would never be identified, and her cause of death would remain unknown. While police were investigating the crime scene, an elderly couple was on a walk nearby. They saw a big crowd forming and decided to investigate. They decided to inform their friend of what was going on, and then their friend decided to join them back to the crime scene. When they arrived back at the crime scene with their friend, the man was standing there and noticed this putrid smell getting worse and worse over time. So he decided to investigate a deepened hole right next to him. In this hole would be the body of victim 12. When police were informed, they found the ribs, vertebrae, and pelvic bone of a human. Unfortunately, with so little evidence, they could only determine that this victim was a male, and he would never be identified. Out of 4 possible victims, only one has substantial information. She would be known as Lady of the Lake. On September 5th, 1934, a man was walking along Lake Erie looking for driftwood. He saw what he thought was a giant pile of stripped wood. Unfortunately, what he found was the lower half of a woman's torso cut at the knees. He immediately calls the police, and police arrive on scene and take it straight to the coroner. The coroner determines that the body had been dead about 6 months and in the water for 4. The woman's body had been covered in some sort of chemical, leaving her skin red and leather-like in texture. Other than the upper part of one of her arms, no other body part was ever found, and unfortunately, she would never be identified. Elliot Ness was brought in by the mayor as lead investigator for the Torso murders. People think Elliot was constantly being taunted by the killer, especially when victim 12 was found not far from victim 11. This caused Elliot to round up 35 police officers and detectives. His plan was to search through the hobo jungles. He believed that the killer was living there, so the police officers raided throughout the run and arrested 63 men, while everyone else searched the deserted makeshift homes for clues and evidence. Elliot was so enraged not being able to find the killer, he set the shacks on fire and burnt the hobo jungles to the ground. The people of the town were devastated and angry with Elliot. He would be taunted by the killer for years after the killings ended. He was sent letters and even pictures that led him nowhere. In July of 1939, a 52-year-old man named Frank would confess to the murder of Flo. The man claimed to live with Flo and know 2 other victims. His confession was all over the place, and the police believed that the whole thing was rehearsed. Frank was booked, and awaiting his trial, he unfortunately would never attend. He was found hanged in his cell. Oddly enough, in Frank's autopsy, he had 6 broken ribs. Also kind of weird is that he hung himself from a hook that was 5'7", and Frank was 5'8". Many people believe that Frank was innocent and also murdered. A letter came addressed to the chief of police on December 21st, 1938. The letter states, "Chief of Police, you can rest easy now as I have come out to sunny California for the winter. I felt bad operating on those people, but science must advance. I will soon astound the medical profession, a man with only a DC. What did their lives mean in comparison to hundreds of sick and disease-twisted bodies? No one missed them when I failed. My last case was successful. Right now, I have a volunteer who will absolutely prove my theory. They called me mad and a butcher, but the truth will out. I have failed but once here. The body has not been found and never will be. I feel it is my duty to dispose of the bodies I do. It is God's will to not let them suffer." Police records have all but been destroyed or lost for this case, and the murderer may never be known. 8 years later, Elizabeth Short would be found in the same manner as the Torso killer's previous victims. She was drained of all blood as well as cut in half. That's why people believe the Cleveland Torso killer is responsible for the infamous Black Dahlia murder, but that's a story for another day. Thanks for watching, folks. Don't forget our social media links are down in the description, as well as our Patreon and merch. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe, and ring the notification bell. Thanks again for watching, and remember, stay curious.